Somewhere, in a room that nobody who reads this is likely to ever enter, there is a painting. It is large, much larger than a person, wider than the wall of most ordinary rooms, and it consists almost entirely of black and white, with words running across it in the irregular, urgent handwriting that became one of the most recognizable visual signatures in the history of New Zealand art. The words are about death. The words are about what comes after death. The words are the expression of a particular and powerful intelligence grappling with the largest questions available to a human mind. Questions about meaning and loss, and the possibility that there is something beyond the loss that makes the loss bearable. The painting is called Victory Over Death. It was made by Colin McCann in 1970 in the studio in Titirangi, where he did much of the work that would eventually establish him as the most significant visual artist New Zealand has produced. It belongs, in the moral and cultural sense, to the country that produced the man who made it, and to the people who understand what it says. In the legal and physical sense, it belongs to whoever is holding it right now, and whoever that is has not chosen to make themselves known. The painting has been missing since 1997. It was taken, in circumstances that have been partially described and extensively debated but never fully resolved, from the institution that held it. The investigation that followed produced enough information to describe what happened in outline, but not enough, apparently, to produce either the painting or a satisfactory public accounting of what became of it. The years passed. The investigation continued, in whatever form investigations take when they cease to be a priority. The painting remained missing. This is a story about a stolen painting. It is also a story about the man who made it, about the specific combination of genius and self-destruction and spiritual urgency and sustained artistic poverty that produced one of the most powerful bodies of work in the history of art in this part of the world. It is a story about what New Zealand does with its most exceptional creative minds, and what happens to the things those minds produce, and what the country's relationship to the theft of its most important cultural object tells us about the country's relationship to that object, and to the person who made it, and to the person who once made it.
Colin McCann was born on the 1st of August, 1919, in the South Island city of Timaru, a modest harbor city at the edge of the Canterbury Plains, a city that contains no particular prophecy of the scale of what was going to emerge from it. His upbringing was conventional, in the ways that South Island New Zealand upbringings in the 1920s were conventional. Church, family, the particular combination of Presbyterian solemnity and outdoor life that characterized the social landscape. What was not conventional was the intensity of his response to the visual world. He drew, he painted, he looked at the New Zealand landscape with an attention that was different in kind from the attention of someone who simply finds scenery pleasant. Different in the way that all genuine artistic response is different, in being simultaneously a perception and an interpretation, a seeing and a saying. He studied at the Canterbury College School of Art, where the combination of European modernist influence and the specific New Zealand landscape that the school's tradition engaged with produced in him the foundations of a practice that would eventually be recognized as the most significant in New Zealand's art history. But recognition was not immediate. Recognition was, for most of McCann's working life, something that existed elsewhere, among other people, and that the New Zealand art world was particularly slow to extend to him. The reasons for this slowness are various and interesting, and speak to the specific character of the New Zealand cultural moment he occupied. His work was difficult. Not difficult in the sense of being technically obscure. His technique was direct and unadorned, the application of paint straightforward and intentional rather than virtuosic. Difficult in the sense that it demanded something from its viewer that most New Zealand viewers in the 40s and 50s and 60s were not prepared to give. It demanded engagement with spiritual and existential questions that the pragmatic, outdoor, anti-intellectual strain of New Zealand culture found uncomfortable. It demanded attention to the text, the words painted across the canvases, the biblical passages and personal statements and urgent declarations, which required a kind of reading that looking at a landscape painting does not require. It demanded, in short, a different relationship between the viewer and the artwork than New Zealand's emerging art culture had yet developed. And he was poor. Not poor in the way that artists in comfortable countries with functional arts funding systems can sometimes be technically poor while remaining practically comfortable. Poor in the way that means you worry about whether there is food. That means you teach commercial art to pay rent. That means the studio where you do the most important work of your life is whatever space you can secure on whatever terms you can manage with whatever resources are available. He had a family, a wife, Anne Hamblett, who was herself an artist, and children who grew up in the circumstances that the parents' combined artistic incomes produced. The circumstances were not lavish. The art world that surrounded him was small and not always generous. There were people who understood early what he was doing and who supported him. Frank Sargeson, the writer who occupied a similarly central and similarly undercompensated position in New Zealand literature, was among the most important. There were critics and curators who saw in his work something that they worked to communicate to a wider public that was slow to hear the communication. But the public institutions, the galleries, the purchasing bodies, the foundations that in other countries would have provided some material support to a working artist of his quality, were not equal to what he represented. He taught, he painted, he drank. The drinking is the part of the story that the official retrospectives and the National Monument version of Colin McCann have found most difficult to accommodate. It is an uncomfortable fact. Uncomfortable because it complicates the uncomplicated version of the story, in which New Zealand failed a genius who spent his life making work of extraordinary quality in poverty and obscurity, and in which the failure is entirely the culture's and none of it is the man's. The drinking complicates that story in ways that are not entirely resolvable. It was, by the accounts of people who knew him and worked with him, a serious and progressive alcoholism that affected his personal relationships, his professional life, and the sustained arc of the practice in ways that are not possible to separate from the arc itself. What did the drinking produce? What did it cost?
These are questions that the complete story of Colin McCann requires, not as a criticism of the man, but as an honest engagement with the reality of who he was and what the work came out of. The paintings he made in his most productive decades are among the most spiritually urgent and formally powerful works of art produced in New Zealand. They were made by someone who was also, simultaneously, fighting a disease that the people around him could see and that he could not always see, or could see and could not always address. The relationship between the alcoholism and the work is one of the most genuinely difficult questions in his biography. There are people who argue that the particular intensity of the work, the urgency, the rawness, the sense of a person pressing against the absolute limit of what paint and canvas can express, was produced in part by the same psychological conditions that the drinking expressed and the drinking intensified. There are others who argue that the drinking was simply a disease that took from him time and energy and relationships that would otherwise have gone into the work, and that the work he made was made in spite of the alcoholism, rather than because of or alongside it. Both positions are probably partly right. Neither one is the whole truth. The whole truth is more uncomfortable than either, because it requires holding in mind simultaneously the extraordinary quality of what he produced and the real and irreversible costs that the production and the alcoholism together imposed on the people around him and on himself. The later years were the years in which those costs became most visible. The 70s were difficult. The early 80s were worse. By the mid-80s, the man who had spent 50 years producing some of the most powerful visual art in the country's history was no longer producing it with the sustained commitment that had defined him. The deterioration was real, and it was progressive, and it was painful to witness for the people who had known him in his full powers. He died on the 27th of May, 1987, in Auckland. He had been in care.
The man who made Victory Over Death, who wrote God's name and Death's name across large canvases in urgent handwriting, who spent 50 years making arguments in paint about what it means to be human in the specific geographical and spiritual context of New Zealand. He died in a facility, diminished, a long way from the studio in Titirangi and a long way from the work that had been the entire shape of his adult life. And then, 10 years later, the painting disappeared. Victory Over Death is not a small painting. It is approximately 1.5 meters tall and more than 6 meters wide, a work of the physical scale that McCann favored for the most ambitious statements of his career, the scale that allows text to be written large enough to carry the weight the text is intended to carry. The painting consists of a white background against which a series of New Testament verses from the first letter to the Corinthians are written in black letters. The passage in which Paul makes his argument for the resurrection, the passage that contains the lines about the last enemy being defeated, about death being swallowed up in victory, about the sting of death,
and the grave's capacity for victory being removed by something that Paul calls grace. The painting is the most sustained and serious engagement with the question of death and what follows it that McCann's career produced. It is also, by the judgment of most of the critics and curators and scholars who have spent time with his work, the most powerful single painting he made, the one in which the ambition of the project and the formal quality of the execution and the spiritual urgency of the content are most completely aligned. It is the painting that any reckoning with his significance as an artist must begin with. It is the painting that, if his work is ever fully understood internationally, will be the work through which that understanding is reached. It is also missing, and the story of how it came to be missing and what the response to its disappearance tells us about New Zealand's relationship to the cultural objects it claims to treasure is the most important and the most poorly examined chapter of McCann's legacy. The fact occurred in 1997.
The details of how it occurred, and in what context and by whose specific action, are matters that the relevant investigations have addressed without producing a complete public account that resolves the most important questions. What is publicly known is that the painting was taken, that the taking was connected to a context of political and cultural protest, and that despite the time elapsed and the scale of the loss, the painting has not been recovered. The gap between what is publicly known and what would need to be known to answer the question of where victory over death is now, and who has it, and what would be required to return it, is a gap that the relevant institutions have not shown urgency in closing. The years since 1997 have been years in which the investigation has proceeded, in whatever form it proceeds, without producing the result that the scale and significance of the loss would seem to demand. Where is the painting? That is the question. It is a simple question. It has an answer. The answer is located in the specific physical space where the painting currently exists, and that space is accessible in principle to anyone with the knowledge of where it is. The problem is that the knowledge is held privately, and the people who hold it have not been induced by investigation or by appeal or by the passage of time or by the changing circumstances of whoever commissioned or carried out or benefited from the taking to share it. What would it take to find victory over death? What pressure, what incentive, what changed condition would produce the information that leads from the gallery where it was taken to the room where it currently sits? These are not rhetorical questions. They are practical ones, and their practical answers exist in the specific mechanics of the investigation that is nominally continuing, and in the specific decisions that the relevant institutions have made about how much resource and urgency to assign to the recovery. The resource and the urgency have not, by the evidence of the outcome, been sufficient. 27 years after the theft, the painting is still missing. The investigation has not produced a result, and the country's most important artwork is in the custody of whoever decided, in 1997, that the custody should be theirs. Who made that decision? What were they trying to achieve? Did they achieve it? And is the painting still intact? Still the physical object that McCann made in Titirangi in 1970? Still the black and white and urgent text about death and what comes after? Or has the 27 years of private custody produced some change in its condition that the world will eventually have to reckon with? These questions have answers. The answers are somewhere. And the fact that the answers are somewhere and that the institution responsible for the painting's safekeeping has not produced them in 27 years is the fact that the tribute version of Colin McCann's story has found most convenient to leave unexamined. The tribute version has photographs. The tribute version has retrospectives and critical essays, and the record auction prices that his paintings achieve when they appear in the major sale rooms. The tribute version has the national monument, the McCann who is now acknowledged as the greatest visual artist New Zealand produced, who is reproduced on postage stamps and in school curricula and in the marketing materials of galleries that want to be associated with the prestige of his name. The tribute version does not have the painting. And the tribute version does not have the honest accounting of what it means that the painting is missing, and what the response to its disappearance tells us about how seriously New Zealand's institutions take the responsibility of caring for the cultural objects they claim to hold in trust for the public. The New Zealand art world that Colin McCann navigated from the 1940s onward was not a large world. It was a world of a few galleries in a few cities, of a handful of critics whose judgments shaped what the public institutions purchased and what collectors considered worth their attention,
of an audience that was growing, but that had not yet developed the vocabulary or the confidence to engage with work that made the demands on it that McCann's work made. It was also a world shaped by the specific cultural anxieties of a settler nation that was in the process of working out what its cultural identity was. A nation that was not British, quite, and not something else yet either, and that was finding its way toward an understanding of itself through the culture its artists and writers and musicians were producing. McCann was central to that finding, though the centrality was not immediately recognized.
What he was doing, using the New Zealand landscape not as scenery, but as theological argument, using the light and the hills and the coastlines as the medium through which he made statements about faith and doubt and death, and the possibility of meaning in a world where meaning is not guaranteed, was so specific and so ambitious and so unlike what anyone else in New Zealand was doing that it required a critical infrastructure and an audience formation period that simply did not exist in the 1940s and 50s. He continued anyway. This is the characteristic that defines his career as much as the quality of the paintings themselves, the continuation in the face of indifference, the persistence of production without the feedback loop of commercial success or institutional support that sustains most artists through the difficult middle years of a career. He had enough recognition from enough of the right people to know that what he was doing was real, and he had the internal conviction of someone for whom the work is not a choice but a necessity, not something that could be withheld for lack of encouragement, but something that required expression regardless of the audience's response to it. The text in the paintings is the element that most divided his contemporaries, and that most contemporary viewers find either the most powerful or the most alienating aspect of his work. It is words, actual words, readable words, words that carry specific meanings from specific sources, painted directly onto the canvas in handwriting that is clearly and unmistakably his, that carries his personality as directly as spoken language carries the personality of a speaker. The words are usually from the Bible, from the parts of the Bible that engage with death and the question of what follows it. Paul's letters, the Psalms, passages from the Gospels that deal with the resurrection and the transformation of what seems like ending into something else. Why did he paint words? The question has occupied critics and curators for decades, and the answers they have produced are various and interesting and none of them entirely satisfying. There is the answer that says the words were a response to a Protestant tradition in which the text was the primary medium of spiritual communication and in which images had always been suspect, that McCann was painting in a tradition that distrusted images and was using the image to carry the tradition's own medium. There is the answer that says the words were a response to the inadequacy of pure form, that he had reached the limit of what paint and shape and color could say and needed the additional precision of language to say what the paintings needed to say. There is the answer that says the words were an assertion of the specific, that in a country whose relationship to its own cultural identity was still forming, the act of writing specific words in a specific handwriting on a specific canvas was an act of claiming, of insisting that this time and this place and this person were real and were making something real. All of these answers are probably true, and none of them is sufficient. The paintings themselves are the most complete answer available, and the paintings can only be experienced in the presence of the physical objects. Victory over death is the most complete answer of all. It is not possible to reproduce it adequately in a photograph or a reproduction. It requires the physical encounter, the standing in front of the large canvas, the reading of the words in their specific scale and their specific arrangement, the experience of the text as both linguistic content and visual form. It requires being in the room with it. And the room it should be in, the gallery where the public should be able to stand in front of it and have that experience, is a room that nobody has been standing in front of it in since 1997. The physical deterioration that a large canvas undergoes in improper storage conditions over 27 years is not trivial. Canvas is a biological material. It responds to humidity and temperature and light in ways that produce irreversible changes if the conditions are not controlled. The acrylic paint that McCann used in Victory over Death is more stable than oil paint, but not immune to the effects of improper storage. It can crack, it can yellow, it can be damaged by the kind of handling that non-professional storage involves. If the painting is in the custody of someone who does not have the resources or the expertise to maintain it in conditions appropriate to its conservation, The physical condition of victory over death may be substantially different from the physical condition it was in when it was taken. This is one of the most urgent aspects of the missing painting story that the public conversation about it has not adequately engaged with. The question of where it is and when it might be returned is urgent in obvious ways. The question of what condition it will be in when it returns, whether the 27 years of uncontrolled custody have left the most important painting in New Zealand's art history damaged beyond the possibility of restoration, is the question that haunts the search in a way that the search's public presentation has not fully communicated. McCann would have understood this. He had a relationship with the physical objects he produced that was complicated, that combined a genuine respect for the painting as an object with an understanding that the object's value was ultimately in what it communicated rather than in its physical survival. He had said things, in interviews and in letters and in the conversations that his colleagues and students remembered, that suggested he understood his paintings as statements rather than as precious artifacts, as arguments made in paint, rather than as objects to be preserved for their own sake. But the statement that victory over death makes is one that requires the physical object to make it. The text painted in McCann's handwriting on that specific canvas is not separable from the canvas. The experience of standing before those words at that scale in that specific configuration is not available through any reproduction. The painting is the statement, and the statement is the painting. And the statement has been unavailable for 27 years because the painting has been in private custody since 1997. What would it take to bring it back? The question is practical. It has practical answers. The answers involve the specific mechanics of who holds the painting and what they want, and what they would accept in exchange for returning it. These are not unknowable things. They are things that a sufficiently resourced and sufficiently motivated investigation could establish.
The question is whether the investigation has been and continues to be sufficiently resourced and sufficiently motivated. The evidence of the outcome, 27 years without recovery, suggests that it has not been. And the question of why it has not been, why the most important painting in New Zealand's cultural history has been missing for a quarter of a century without producing the level of investigative pressure and public demand that its significance would seem to justify, is the question that the tribute version of the McCann story has most consistently avoided. The tribute knows the painting is missing. The tribute acknowledges the theft. The tribute includes it in the official narrative of McCann's legacy as a regrettable fact, a loss, a wound in the collection of New Zealand's cultural patrimony. What the tribute does not do is ask the questions that the 27-year absence of a result should provoke: whether the investigation has been adequate, whether the resource and urgency have matched the scale of the loss, whether the institutions responsible for the painting's safekeeping and its recovery have been held to the accountability that the scale of the loss demands. These questions are uncomfortable. They implicate institutions that the tribute version of the story would prefer to present as the custodians and celebrators of McCann's legacy, rather than as the parties whose failure of care preceded the loss and whose failure of investigation has prolonged it. They require a critical engagement with the official response to the theft that the official narrative has not produced. The painting is somewhere. It has been somewhere since 1997. The question of where it is and how it gets back is a question that has answers. And the fact that those answers have not been produced in 27 years is a fact that the country that claims Colin McCann as its greatest artist has not adequately reckoned with. He made the painting. He made it with the full force of his intelligence and his spiritual urgency, and the specific quality of his visual thinking that produced the most significant body of work in New Zealand art history. He made it in 1970, 17 years before his death, in the studio in Titirangi, in the circumstances of creative poverty and artistic conviction that characterized his entire working life. The painting outlasted him.
It outlasted the country's failure to adequately support him. It outlasted the alcohol and the poverty and the slow deterioration of the later years. And then, 10 years after his death, it was taken. He does not know it is missing. That too is part of the story. The specific context in which victory over death was taken is the context that makes the theft simultaneously easier and harder to understand than a conventional art theft. It was not taken by a professional art thief operating for the commercial art market, or at least the evidence does not support that reading of the taking, and the absence of the painting from the commercial market in the 27 years since suggests that if commercial gain was the motive, the plan has not been executed. It was taken in a context that was political, that was connected to arguments about cultural ownership and indigenous rights, and the relationship between New Zealand's European cultural institutions and the Maori world that McCann's own work had engaged with deeply and seriously throughout his career. This is the part of the story that makes the theft most interesting and most uncomfortable simultaneously. McCann had spent his career making work that engaged with the Maori world, not as an outsider appropriating material from another culture, though the questions about appropriation are legitimate and have been raised, but as someone who understood, from his decades of living and working in New Zealand, that the Maori relationship to the land and to the spiritual was a relationship that had something essential to say to the questions his paintings were asking. The Urewera murals, the paintings that took their names from Maori places, the visual vocabulary that drew on Maori forms and spatial understanding in ways that were meant to honor a connection rather than perform an exoticism. The taking of his work in a context of Maori political protest is therefore a story full of ironies that the official response to the theft has not chosen to examine in depth. The artist whose work made the most sustained effort of any New Zealand painter to engage seriously with Maori culture has had work taken in the name of Maori cultural rights. The man who spent his career arguing, in paint, for the spiritual significance of this land and its indigenous relationship to it has had the most powerful expression of that argument removed from public view in an act that claims some of the same ground.
These ironies are not a reason to minimize the loss or to diminish the urgency of the recovery. They are a reason to engage with the theft's context more seriously than the official response has done, to ask what the taking was intended to accomplish and whether the taking has accomplished it, and what the conditions would need to be for the painting to be returned in a way that both recovers the object and addresses whatever the taking was intended to address. The people who took the painting, or who were responsible for taking it, or who know what happened to it after it was taken, have not been publicly identified and held to account in the way that a theft of this magnitude would seem to require. The reasons for this are not entirely clear from the public record. The investigation has been proceeding, in its various forms, for 27 years. The result of the proceeding has not included the identification and prosecution of the people responsible. Whether this reflects the genuine difficulty of the investigation or some other factor, a choice about how aggressively to pursue a theft whose political context made the pursuit complex, a judgment about the costs and benefits of aggressive investigation in the specific cultural context of 1997 New Zealand, is not answerable from the public record. What is answerable, or should be, if the relevant authorities were required to answer it, is the question of what the investigation has done and what it has not done, and what it would take to move it from its current state to a state in which the painting is recovered. This is the question that should have been asked publicly and consistently since 1997, and that has instead been asked only intermittently and without producing the pressure that sustained public attention would generate. The art world's response to the theft has been more public and more sustained than the investigative authorities' response, but has similarly not produced the painting. The gallery community, the critical establishment, the collectors, and the academic researchers who work with McCann's legacy have maintained awareness of the theft and have continued to describe victory over death as missing and to note its significance. But awareness and description are not recovery. The painting requires more than continued noting of its absence.
There is a particular quality to the way missing things are talked about when the talking is the only available substitute for the thing itself. The language becomes a kind of placeholder, a way of maintaining the relationship to the absent object by speaking about it, of performing the value that the absence has denied. The critical writing about victory over death that has been produced in the years since the theft has this quality. It describes the painting with the precision and the passion appropriate to its significance. It insists on what the loss represents. It holds open the expectation of return. And it does all of this in the absence of the painting, in the room where the painting should be, addressing an audience that can only imagine what the physical object would provide. McCann was interested in presence and absence as theological concepts. They run through his work in ways that the most sophisticated readings of the paintings have traced carefully. The presence and absence of God in human experience,
The presence and absence of meaning in a landscape that can seem to offer either or neither. The presence and absence of the resurrection. The question of whether the transformation Paul describes in the passage of the Corinthians that victory over death takes as its text is a description of something real or a description of something hoped for. The absence of the painting that addresses these questions is itself a kind of commentary on the questions. Not a commentary that McCann would have chosen or would have found meaningful. He was not interested in the absence of his work. He was interested in its presence and in the experience that presence could produce. But a commentary that the situation has produced, regardless of his interests and intentions. Victory over death is about the absence of death in the face of something larger. The painting itself is absent. There is an irony in this that is too pointed to be entirely accidental, and too painful to be found interesting for long. Where is the painting? The question is the center of this story, and it is the question that this story cannot answer, because the answer is held by the people who have not chosen to provide it. What this story can do is describe the weight of the question, the years it has been asked, and the urgency it carries, and the specific failure of institutions and individuals that has allowed it to remain unanswered for so long.
Colin McCollin spent his life making arguments in paint. Victory over death is the most powerful of those arguments, and the argument has been interrupted, removed from the conversation it was having with the public that should be standing in front of it, by an act whose full circumstances have not been publicly resolved. He deserves better. The argument deserves to be continued, and New Zealand, the country that claims him as its greatest artist, and that has spent the years since his death building his reputation into something commensurate with his actual significance, owes him the return of the painting that most fully expresses what that significance is. The room where victory over death should be hanging is empty. It has been empty for 27 years, and the question of how to fill it is the most important unanswered question in New Zealand's cultural history. Someone knows the answer. The question is whether New Zealand cares enough about its greatest painting to make them say it. Colin McConnon's relationship with alcohol is the part of his biography that New Zealand culture has found most difficult to incorporate into the official version of his story. It is present in the accounts of people who knew him, in the memoirs and the oral histories and the biographical research that has been done since his death, but it occupies a peripheral position in the public narrative about him, acknowledged rather than examined, noted as a biographical fact rather than engaged with as a dimension of the career that requires the same attention as the paintings themselves. This reluctance is understandable. The painting of a man as a national monument requires a certain selectivity, a focus on what can be celebrated, and an elision of what complicates the celebration. And alcoholism complicates celebration in ways that are real and not entirely soluble. It introduces responsibility and culpability, and the specific suffering of the people around the alcoholic that the tribute form is not designed to address. It introduces the possibility that some of the suffering associated with his life was not entirely the culture's fault, that the poverty and the obscurity and the difficult conditions were real and unjust, and also present alongside a disease that McConnon himself was navigating with the limited tools that his generation and his context provided for navigating it. But the reluctance to engage with the alcoholism honestly is also a form of disrespect, a refusal to see the full person, to acknowledge the full weight of what he was managing, to understand the complete context in which the extraordinary paintings were made. The paintings were made by a specific human being in specific circumstances, and the circumstances included the alcoholism as surely as they included the poverty and the spiritual conviction and the marriage and the children and the studio in Titirangi and the landscape of the Northland coast. What did the drinking mean to him? It is not possible to answer this from the outside. The internal experience of alcoholism is specific and private, and not accessible through biographical research. What is accessible is the external evidence, the accounts of people who knew him, the timeline of the career in relation to the timeline of the disease, the quality of the work at different stages, and what the staging suggests about the relationship between the condition and the production. The evidence suggests that the drinking was a problem from relatively early in his career, that it was recognized as a problem by people around him before it was acknowledged as a problem in the public record, and that the later years were years in which the disease had advanced to the point where it was affecting not only his personal life and professional relationships, but his capacity to do the work that was the architecture of everything he was. The productive output of the later years is thinner than the productive output of the middle decades. The exhibitions become less frequent. The sustained projects become shorter.
This is not primarily a story of waste. The work that he did produce in those later years includes things of real quality, and the total body of work is extensive and profound. But it is a story of something being taken from the available time and energy and concentration that the work needed. And the something that was being taken had a name, and the name was alcoholism. And the tribute version of the story has found that name difficult to say clearly. The cultural institutions that were responsible for supporting and preserving McCaughan's work during his lifetime were not always equal to that responsibility.
This is a larger story than the alcoholism. It is a story about arts funding and cultural infrastructure, and the specific neglect that New Zealand directed at its most significant visual artist during the decades when support would have made the greatest difference. But the alcoholism and the institutional neglect are not entirely separate stories. A system that had adequately supported McCaughan financially might have produced conditions in which the progression of the disease was different. A system that had engaged honestly with the disease might have provided support that the disease's progression could not access in the actual conditions of his life. These are counterfactuals, and counterfactuals have limited usefulness. What the consideration of them does is illuminate the specific ways in which the culture around McCaughan failed him, not through malice, not through indifference exactly, but through the combination of limited resources and limited imagination, and the specific New Zealand tendency to wait until something is unambiguously great before supporting it that has cost the country significant cultural achievements across multiple disciplines. He made the work anyway. This is the most important fact. In conditions that a more generous institutional context would have made easier and a more honest personal context would have made different, he made the work. He made it with the urgency of someone who understood, at some level, that the time was limited and the arguments needed to be made before the time ran out. He made Victory Over Death in 1970, and he continued making work for another 17 years. And then the capacity to make work left him, and he spent his last years in care. The work he made is what remains. Victory Over Death is the most important piece of what remains. And the fact that it is missing, that the most important thing he made is the thing that cannot currently be seen, that the argument he made most powerfully is the argument that has been silenced by its removal from public view, is the wound in his legacy that nothing else in the official story adequately addresses. Find the painting. That is the obligation that New Zealand owes the man it claims as its greatest artist. Not the retrospectives, not the stamp, not the auction records, not the academic essays and the critical monographs. Those are gestures. The obligation is to find the painting, to apply to the question of where it is the urgency that its significance demands, to make the recovery of Victory Over Death a priority that matches the scale of the loss. The loss has been absorbing for 27 years. The priority has not been commensurate with the loss. The painting is somewhere. The somewhere has an address, and the person at the address has not been required, by investigation or by public pressure or by the changed conditions of 27 years, to give the painting back. That is the situation. That is what the tribute has not resolved. And that is what the complete story of Colin McCaughan, the honest story, the story equal to what he gave and what was taken and what remains owed, requires the country to change. The room where Victory Over Death should be is still empty. The question of who will fill it is still unanswered. And the man who made the painting has been dead for 37 years, which is exactly 37 years longer than the painting has been gone from the walls where it belongs. He made the argument. It is still waiting to be heard. The landscape that McCaughan painted is still there. The Northland Hills and the West Auckland coast and the specific quality of New Zealand light. The way the light here differs from the light of Europe. The way the distances between things are different. The way the sky relates to the ground in this particular geography. All of this is still present and still available to anyone who goes to look at it. What has changed is what we know to look for in it. McCaughan's paintings taught New Zealand to see its own landscape as something more than scenery, to see it as a space with theological implications, as a place where the questions about meaning and death and what follows death are not abstract, but are grounded in the specific physical reality of hills and harbors and the light falling across them. This is the most enduring contribution of his career, and it is a contribution that the theft of Victory Over Death cannot fully remove.
The paintings that are in museums and galleries and private collections continue to do this work.
The Northland panels and the Urawira murals and the great series of I Am paintings and the hundreds of works across 6 decades of production, these continue to be available, continue to change the way people see the landscape they live in, continue to make the arguments that Makhan spent his life making. But victory over death is the argument made at its fullest. It is the painting where the text and the scale and the formal execution and the spiritual content are most completely aligned. It is the painting that would change the most minds, if the minds that needed changing could stand in front of it. It is the painting that makes the strongest case for why Makhan matters, not just within New Zealand, but in the larger context of 20th century art. Why his engagement with faith and doubt and death in the specific medium of paint and text and New Zealand landscape is not a regional curiosity, but a genuine and significant contribution to the questions that art has always been trying to answer. The galleries that hold his other work understand this. The curators who work with his legacy understand this. The critics and the scholars who have spent careers examining what he made understand this. They all work in the knowledge that the most important thing is missing, that the most powerful single statement of his significance is unavailable, that the case for his importance must be made without the exhibit that would clinch the case beyond argument. This is not an acceptable situation for a country that claims to value what Makhan made. It is a situation that should generate urgency. The urgency has not been commensurate with the loss, and the absence of urgency is itself a statement about what New Zealand actually values, and what it merely claims to value. The commercial value of Makhan's work has increased dramatically since his death. The auction records for his paintings, the prices achieved in the major sale rooms when his work appears, are now in the range that establishes him firmly among the most valuable artists the Southern Hemisphere has produced. This commercial recognition is real, and it represents a genuine shift in how the culture values what he made. It is also, to a certain extent, a form of the same failure that characterized the culture's relationship to him during his life. The validation through price, rather than through the more difficult and more important work of engaging seriously with what the paintings say. Makhan was not particularly interested in what his paintings were worth commercially. He was interested in what they said. He worked in conditions of sustained financial difficulty throughout most of his career, not because he was indifferent to money, but because the money was not available in the amounts that would have made the financial difficulty less acute. The posthumous commercial success of his work is a fact that he did not live to experience, and that his estate and the people who loved him may find some bittersweet satisfaction in. But it does not address the failure that his poverty and obscurity during his working life represent. The failure is specific. It is the failure of a cultural system to provide adequate support to its most significant working artist, to ensure that the conditions in which he was working were adequate to the demands of the work, that the financial anxiety was not a constant companion of the creative effort, that the teaching and the commercial work that he did to supplement the income from the paintings did not drain time and energy from the practice that was the most important thing he was doing. The failure cannot be undone. The years of poverty cannot be returned. The teaching time cannot be converted back into studio time. The alcohol-related deterioration of the later years cannot be reversed. What can be done, what the country that claims Makhan as its greatest artist is obligated to do, is to ensure that the failure does not continue in the specific form that the theft of victory over death represents. To find the painting, to return it to public view, to make the argument it contains available again to the people who need to stand in front of it. The obligation is not complicated. It requires will and resource and the willingness to treat the recovery of the painting as the priority it should be. It does not require a genius comparable to Makhan's, or a spiritual urgency comparable to his, or the kind of artistic conviction that kept him working through poverty and obscurity and a progressive disease of the will. It requires the ordinary competence of institutions doing the work they exist to do. The institutions have not done that work adequately in 27 years. The painting is still missing. And the argument that Colin McKeon spent his life making about death and what follows death, about the possibility that meaning survives loss, about the transformation that Paul describes in the passage from the Corinthians that victory over death takes as its text, is still waiting in a room somewhere to be heard. He made the argument. He made it with everything he had. And the country that claims the argument as its greatest cultural achievement has not yet done what it takes to make sure the argument can be heard. That is the account that is outstanding. That is the obligation that is unpaid. And that is the question that the complete story of Colin McCahon, the honest story, the story equal to what he made and what was taken and what the country owes, requires the country to answer. Find the painting. That is the beginning and the end of what is owed. The rest is details. Important details, illuminating details. Details that explain how the situation became what it is and why it has continued so long. But details in service of the central obligation, which is simple and which has not been met. Find the painting. Bring it back. Put it in the room where it belongs. Let the people who need to stand in front of it stand in front of it. That is what Colin McCahon made it for. That is what the country that claims him owes him. And that is what, 27 years after the theft, remains undone. The specific formal qualities of victory over death, the qualities that make it the most powerful single painting McCahon produced, are worth describing in some detail, because the description is one of the few ways of making the missing thing present to people who have not seen the actual object, and who may never see it if the painting is not recovered. The scale is the first thing. The painting is large, in the way that the most ambitious public statements in the history of painting are large, in the way of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and the large canvases of the abstract expressionists, and the environments that the land art movement produced. Not large for its own sake, not large as a demonstration of resources or ambition, but large because the argument requires a scale that matches its stakes. The argument is about death, about the largest thing that happens to every person, about the question of whether there is anything on the other side of it. An argument of that scale requires a physical presence that makes the viewer feel the weight of the question, not merely think about it. The text runs across the white canvas in black letters that are simultaneously handwritten and monumental. They have the immediacy of handwriting, the sense of a specific person in a specific moment making marks, and they have the scale of public declaration, the insistence of someone who needs to be heard from a distance. The words are from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, the passage about the resurrection that concludes with the question, "O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory?" Paul's answer to the question is the resurrection. McCahon's answer to the question is more complicated, because McCahon's faith was more complicated than Paul's. Was the faith of a 20th century person who has absorbed the doubts of modernity, and who cannot simply assert the resurrection as a fact without also registering the difficulty of the assertion. The painting does not resolve the question. It holds it open, insists on the urgency of the question, while acknowledging that the resolution requires something that cannot be compelled by art or by argument, that requires a leap that paint and canvas can prepare for but cannot execute. This is what makes the painting great. Not the declaration of faith. There are plenty of paintings that declare faith, and most of them are less interesting than this one. But the holding of the question open, in a form that forces the viewer to feel the weight of it, that refuses the comfort of a premature resolution, that insists on remaining in the space of genuine uncertainty, where the question of death and what follows it actually lives for most human beings. McCahon knew about this space. He had lived in it for most of his adult life. The space where faith and doubt coexist without resolving into either certainty or abandonment, where the spiritual urgency is real and the intellectual difficulty is also real, where the question of meaning in the face of death is not answered, but is held and examined and returned to. He had lived there through the poverty and the obscurity and the alcoholism and the difficult middle years and the declining late years. He had lived there, and he had made paintings from the living of it. Victory over death is the most direct expression of that living. It is the painting where the decades of thinking and doubting and affirming and doubting again are most fully present, where the specific quality of his faith, which was hard-won and honest and resistant to easy consolation, is most fully visible. It is the painting that required everything he had learned in 50 years of making paintings, and 50 years of being a particular kind of person in a particular place at a particular time. And it is in a room somewhere that is not the room it was made for. It is in a room where the people who need to stand in front of it cannot stand in front of it. It is absent from the conversation that its presence would change. The theft of victory over death is not only the theft of an object, it is the theft of an argument, the interruption of a conversation that Macan spent his life preparing for, the argument about what follows death, the conversation between a painting and the person standing in front of it, in which the painting asks the question, and the person standing there is the answer that we are still here, still looking, still capable of receiving what the painting has to say. He made the painting for that conversation. The conversation has been interrupted for 27 years, and the country that produced the man who made it has not yet demonstrated the urgency to resume it that the interruption demands. New Zealand has Colin Macan. It has the retrospectives and the scholarship and the auction records and the national monument version of the story. What it does not have is the painting that most fully expresses why any of that matters. The room is still empty. The argument is still waiting. And the obligation to find the painting, to end the interruption, to let the conversation resume, is still outstanding. It will remain outstanding until someone with the will and the resource and the urgency that the situation demands decides that the tribute version of Colin Macan is not enough, that the country owes him more than the monument, that the most important thing it can do for the man it claims as its greatest artist is to find the most important thing he made and put it back where it belongs. That is the story. That is the complete story. The tribute has the other parts. This is the part that remains undone. Find the painting. Bring it home. Let the argument be heard again.
The question of what it means to make art in New Zealand, in this specific geographical and cultural location, at the far edge of the Pacific, at the point where European settler culture and Polynesian culture and the specific qualities of this landscape converge and conflict and produce something that is not quite any of its components, is a question that Colin Macan addressed more directly and more seriously than any other visual artist the country has produced. He addressed it not by making art about New Zealand in the descriptive or documentary sense, not by painting the landmarks or the notable events or the public figures, but by making art from New Zealand, by using the landscape and the cultural situation and the specific spiritual conditions of this place as the medium through which he made arguments about the universal questions. This is the distinction that makes his work matter beyond its local context. The New Zealandness of the paintings is not a limitation. It is the specific ground from which the universal arguments grow. The light on the Northland Hills is not just a landscape detail. It is the specific light through which Macan examines the question of whether meaning is present in the physical world or only imposed upon it by minds that need meaning and invent it in the absence of evidence. The specific quality of that light, the way it falls on that landscape, in that country, in that part of the world, is the specific evidence he uses to address that question. And the Maori world, the indigenous relationship to the land, the Maori understanding of the spiritual significance of the physical world, the specific ways in which Maori culture has always understood the landscape as inhabited by presences and meanings that the European settler tradition had to learn to see, this was not background color for Macan. It was an argument he was in dialogue with, a perspective whose engagement with the questions he was asking was deeper and older than the European tradition he had grown up in, and that he found increasingly to be inadequate to the questions this place posed. The paintings that explicitly engage with Maori language and Maori visual culture are the most controversial in his legacy, for reasons that are legitimate and that the official narrative has handled with varying degrees of honesty.
The question of whether a Pākehā artist can draw on Maori cultural materials without appropriating them, whether the use of Maori text and Maori visual forms by someone who did not grow up inside Maori culture is a form of respect or a form of taking, is a question that does not have a single answer that all parties would accept, and Macan's work is one of the most complex test cases for working out where the line falls. He knew this. The people who spoke with him in the later years of his career record conversations in which he was aware of the complexity of his position, in which he acknowledged the possibility that his use of Maori material was not simply the respectful engagement he intended it to be, in which he was uncertain about the degree to which his relationship to the Maori world entitled him to the things he was drawing from it.
This uncertainty was genuine, and it was not resolved, and the fact that it was not resolved is part of the honest story of his work. The theft of his work in a context connected to Maori political and cultural protest is therefore not an event that sits outside the narrative of his career. It sits inside it. It is connected to questions that the career was always engaging with, questions that the country has not yet resolved, and that the theft has not resolved either. The taking was a statement. What the statement was intended to communicate, and whether the communication has been successful, and what the return of the painting would require from all parties, these are questions that the official response to the theft has not engaged with adequately. A genuine engagement with those questions would require a conversation between the people who know where the painting is and the institutions and the public that want it back, that the structure of the investigation as a criminal matter rather than a cultural negotiation has not facilitated. Criminal investigations do not produce conversations. They produce suspects and charges and prosecutions or failures to prosecute. The complexity of the situation Victory Over Death is in, the complexity that makes it simultaneously a stolen artwork and a political statement and a cultural argument, may require a response that the criminal investigation framework is not designed to provide.
Whether the relevant authorities and the relevant cultural institutions have considered whether a different framework might be more productive is not something the public record makes clear. What the public record makes clear is that the criminal investigation framework has not produced the painting in 27 years. The question of whether a different approach might produce a different result is one that the people responsible for the recovery have not been required to answer publicly. He made the work. It was taken. The taking was connected to arguments about cultural ownership and indigenous rights that the work itself had been in dialogue with throughout its existence. The recovery requires an engagement with those arguments that the official response has not yet managed, and the painting waits, somewhere, for the engagement that would make its return possible. The studio in Titirangi where McCowan did much of his work is gone now. The physical space where the most important paintings in New Zealand's art history were made has been replaced by other uses, which is the ordinary fate of working studios. They are not preserved as monuments while the artist is alive, and they become monuments only after the artist is dead, at which point the specific physical space is often already gone. What remains of the studio is in the paintings. The light and the scale and the urgency and the specific quality of the thinking that was done in that space is present in the work, in the way that the conditions of making are always present in what is made. Victory Over Death was made in a studio that no longer exists. It was made by a man who was no longer alive. It was made in conditions of poverty and spiritual urgency and creative power that converged in 1970 to produce the most important single object in New Zealand's cultural history. And it is missing. The missing is not a small thing. It is not a regrettable footnote to an otherwise complete story. It is the wound at the center of the story, the absence that the tribute circles without filling, the question that everything else in the narrative leads toward and that the narrative has not been able to answer. Find the painting. That is the obligation. It is the one thing that the country that claims Colin McCowan as its greatest artist has not yet done and must do. The retrospectives can wait. The auction records can stand. The critical essays can continue to be written. All of that can wait while the most important work is done. The most important work is finding the painting. The most important work has been waiting for 27 years, and the man who made the painting has been waiting for 37. He cannot wait anymore. But the painting can, and it will wait, in the room where it currently is, until someone decides that finding it is the obligation it actually is. There is a generation of New Zealand artists who grew up with McCowan as the foundational figure of their understanding of what New Zealand art was and could be. Artists who encountered his work in school or in gallery visits or through reproductions in art books, and who found in it the first evidence that the specific circumstances of their own lives could be the material of serious art. The landscape they grew up in was the landscape he had painted. The spiritual questions he was asking were questions their own culture was also asking. The formal choices he had made, the text, the scale, the directness of engagement with the largest available questions, were choices that gave permission for a kind of ambition that New Zealand's modest and self-deprecating cultural tradition did not always encourage. His influence on subsequent generations of New Zealand artists is therefore the most immediate and the most practical expression of his legacy. Not the auction records, not the international recognition,
but the specific change in what New Zealand artists believed was possible that his work produced in the people who encountered it. This is the influence that continues whether or not Victory Over Death is returned, and it is real and significant and worth noting. But the influence would be larger and deeper and more completely expressed if the most powerful example of what his work can do were available for the artists of subsequent generations to stand in front of. The experience of standing in front of Victory Over Death, the specific experience that no reproduction can substitute for, would add something to the understanding of what he achieved that the secondary sources and the photographs and the critical accounts cannot provide. It would add the physical presence of the thing itself, the encounter with the object that the object was made to produce, the conversation between the painting and the person standing in front of it that is the only complete form of the argument.
The artists who have never had that conversation, who have grown up knowing that the painting exists and knowing that it is missing, and knowing that the most important argument Macan made is not available to them in its most complete form, have been denied something real. Not something that ends their development or forecloses their ambitions, but something real. The country's most important painting is its most important pedagogical tool, and it has been unavailable for a quarter of a century. This is the cost that the theft has imposed on people who had nothing to do with the theft. Not just the loss of an object from a museum collection, the loss of an experience, a conversation, a form of understanding that the painting enables and that no substitute can fully replace. The cost falls on every person who would have stood in front of Victory Over Death and been changed by the standing, in whatever specific way the painting changes the people who encounter it honestly. Macan made it for those people. He made it for the person who comes into the gallery without any particular agenda and finds themselves face to face with an argument about death and what follows it, made in a specific handwriting on a large white canvas, insisting that the question be taken seriously. He made it for the encounter, for the moment of contact between the painting and the person that is the purpose of all visual art, the moment when the argument the painting contains becomes the argument the viewer is having with themselves. That moment has been denied to everyone who would have had it since 1997. That is the full count of the theft's cost. Not just the object, not just the insurance value, not just the entry in the gallery's catalog of losses. Every encounter that has not happened, every conversation that has not been had, every mind that has not been changed by the specific experience of standing in front of the most powerful argument Colin Macan ever made. He made the argument. It is still waiting to be heard. It is waiting in a room somewhere, in conditions that may or may not preserve what he made well enough to allow the argument to be made again when the painting returns. It is waiting for the people who should have stood in front of it and have been denied the chance. It is waiting for the country that claims it as its most important cultural object to demonstrate that the claim is more than rhetorical. Find the painting.
That is what the claim requires. That is what the obligation demands. That is what the man who made it deserves from the country that owes him the most honest version of the story it can tell. The story ends when the painting comes home. Until then, it is unfinished. Until then, the most important sentence in New Zealand's cultural history is incomplete. Colin Macan wrote it. The country has not yet found a way to let it be read. The room is empty, the argument is waiting, and the obligation is clear. Find the painting. The story of Colin Macan and the story of Victory Over Death are the same story, told from two angles. One is the story of a man, his talent, his poverty, his faith, his alcoholism, his slow deterioration, his death in care, the posthumous recognition that arrived too late for him to receive it in any meaningful sense. The other is the story of an object, its making, its power, its theft, its continued absence, the failure of the institutions responsible for its recovery to produce results commensurate with the scale of the loss. The two stories are connected at every point. The painting could not exist without the man. The man's legacy cannot be complete without the painting. The country cannot claim either without taking responsibility for both, without acknowledging what it failed to provide the man during his lifetime, and without doing the work required to return the object to the public custody that is its appropriate place. New Zealand has spent 37 years building a monument to Colin Macan. The monument is real and it is deserved, and the recognition it represents, however belated, is genuine. But the monument has a hole in it, a large hole, the exact size and shape of the most important thing the man ever made.
and the hole has been there for 27 years, and the monument's builders have not demonstrated the urgency to fill it that filling it requires. The hole can be filled. The painting exists. The people who know where it is have not been required to say. The requirement has not been applied with the force that the scale of the loss justifies. And so the hole remains, and the monument is incomplete. And the country that claims to have understood what Colin McCann made has not yet demonstrated, in the one way that demonstration matters, that the understanding is real. Find the painting. Bring it home. Let the argument be heard. That is the obligation. It is overdue.
And it is what the complete and honest story of Colin McCann, the man, the work, the theft, the silence, the absence, requires the country to do. He made it for us. We have not yet earned it back. The room where victory over death belongs is a room in a public gallery, accessible to anyone who walks in from the street. It is a room where the light is controlled and the temperature is maintained and the canvas is preserved in the conditions that the object requires. It is a room where a person can stand, without appointment or special access, and encounter the most powerful argument Colin McCann ever made about the largest question available to a human mind. That room is waiting. That encounter is waiting. And the painting that would make both of them possible is somewhere else, in conditions unknown, in custody unaccountable, held by whoever decided in 1997 that the custody should be theirs to keep. The decision was wrong. The keeping has gone on long enough. The argument is needed. Bring the painting home.